Section 2. Buy high quality at a fair price. This section describes and, using evolutionary theory, justifies our buying philosophy at Nalanda. For many investors, identifying the right business to buy at the right time is almost all there is to investing. Switch on CNBC, open a financial newspaper, or read a blog, and you will witness a lot of time spent and ink spilled on companies to buy. This is unfortunate. As we have already seen in Section 1, not buying is an equally, if not more, important skill. There is also a profound conundrum about the buying strategy advocated by most fund managers. Everyone seems to spout the exact same philosophy as this section's topic: buy high quality at a fair price. I challenge you to find me a fund manager who professes to buy poor quality businesses at high prices. Then why does the performance of professional investors vary so widely? One reason, not the only one, but a crucial one, is that our community has wildly different opinions on the meaning of high, quality, and fair. In this section, with many evolutionary theory elements as a backdrop, I will clarify the meaning of these words as they apply to Nalanda. I will discuss what we buy in chapters 2 to 4 and how we buy in chapters 5 to 7. Let's begin. In Siberia. Chapter 2. The Siberian Solution. Hairless dogs have imperfect teeth. Long-haired and coarse-haired animals are apt to have, as is asserted, long or many horns. Pigeons with feathered feet have skin between their outer toes, pigeons with short beaks have small feet, and those with long beaks large feet. Hence, if man goes on selecting and thus augmenting any peculiarity, he will almost certainly unconsciously modify other parts of the structure owing to the mysterious laws of the correlation of growth. Charles Darwin, On the Origin of Species, Chapter 1, Variation under Domestication. An economic franchise arises from a product or service that 1. Is needed or desired, 2. Is thought by its customers to have no close substitute, and 3. Is not subject to price regulation. The existence of all three conditions will be demonstrated by a company's ability to regularly price its product or service aggressively and thereby to earn high rates of return on capital. Moreover, franchises can tolerate mismanagement. Inept managers may diminish a franchise's profitability, but they cannot inflict mortal damage. Warren Buffett, Annual Letter to Shareholders, 1991. Ludmila Trut was dumbfounded. It had all started almost exactly 5 years ago when she had met Dmitry Belyaev, the famous director of the institute. When she heard about Dmitry's project from her professor, she enthusiastically volunteered. Dmitry's candor, passion, and intellect immediately enamored her. And surprisingly, in this male-dominated field in which women were treated as second-class citizens, he had talked to her as a peer, though he was a couple decades older and a renowned personality in the field. Dmitry was trying to enlist a graduate student for a secret project, but Ludmila had not yet even finished her undergraduate studies. He must have seen something unique in the young and talented student to recruit her after just one meeting. She remembered his warnings about the physical hardship, the long hours, and, most importantly, the uncertain fate of her budding scientific career. Dmitry's project carried a lot of risk and could come to naught. And even if the project succeeded, they could not talk about it openly because scientists had been killed for less, including Dmitry's brother. She was grateful to Dmitry for not sugarcoating the work, but it turned out to be far more demanding than she had imagined. She was living in the middle of Siberia, and although she had grown up in Moscow, she had not yet become accustomed to the bone-chilling cold. Worse, the project required her to travel far across the Siberian wilderness on cold, dark, and dreary trains, and she desperately missed her fast-growing toddler, Marina. There were no phones, so she could not even hear her child's voice. It had been 5 years of unrelenting hard work and sacrifice, and she had precious little to show Dmitry. In April 1963, as she approached one of the cages, she was stopped in her tracks. She had never seen anything like this before, nor had any other human being. Was she really witnessing this, or was it an illusion? Had her patience and diligence paid off? She was a scientist and knew that she could not get carried away by emotion. But she could not contain the feeling when it welled up, pure joy. Unbelievably, inconceivably, Ember was wagging his tail. Oh, where do I begin? You have decided to become an investor in listed companies. You value your intellect and discipline, and it seems that many of your friends and cousins are successful investors. Most of them are lying, but that's another story. If they can do it, why can't you? You choose to ignore Buffett's advice about investing in index funds and launch headlong into analyzing businesses. You have read the first chapter of this book, and although you are mildly peeved at the author's degree of risk aversion, you decide that maybe he has a point. Thank you. Heeding his advice, you have done your best to reject the many categories of companies that may increase your blood pressure at a later date. Having shot down hundreds of businesses, you are now excited about selecting high-quality businesses. You open your laptop, launch the application or a website with data on companies, and then, what? What do you do? For every company, you see a gazillion pieces of information on tap. Revenue growth, profit growth, debt level, margin profile, stock price movement, analysts' views, bond ratings, Twitter commentary, shareholder information, top management resumes, conference call transcripts, annual reports, quarterly filings, media coverage, competitor profiles, shares bought or sold by senior management, receivable and inventory levels, CEO statements, Reddit threads, hedge fund ownership, and so much more. And all this is just at the company level. You have listened to so-called experts on TV, many of whom seem to believe that one must also consider macro factors when making a buy decision. You start wallowing in the data on historical GDP growth, projected GDP growth, inflation, inflationary expectations, interest rates, government deficit, employment levels, commodity price movement, projected demographics, money supply, political and regulatory forces, and many such readily available factors supposedly crucial for your buy decision. Should you study all of them or only some of them? How do you start shortlisting the businesses that you want to explore further? What macro factors, if any, should you consider? In short, where do you begin? One option would be to analyze each listed business after you have cast aside the high-risk ones. The problem is that you do not have unlimited time. The number of companies may be in the hundreds and you may need to spend months, if not years, to go through the entire list. One alternative would be to use a two-step process that we use at Nalanda. In the first step, we use one selection criterion that filters out low-quality or average-quality businesses and yields a preliminary list of high-quality companies. In the second step, we do more work on this preliminary list to further whittle it down to a final list. Our investable universe is around 800 Indian businesses with a market value of more than $150 million. Of these, we have rejected close to 350 companies to minimize the risks outlined in the previous chapter. About 450 businesses remain. We then apply a single filter to cut down this list to about 150 firms. Let me call this single filter F. Remember that F simply gives us the preliminary list on which we need to work further to reject or choose businesses. After doing this work, our final list is only about 75 to 80 businesses. F gave us an excellent head start, and it continues to do so because we don't spend any time analyzing a business unless F has cleared it. This chapter is about the F filter, what it is and why. What, in your opinion, is F? To do its job, it needs to satisfy three criteria. First, it should be easily measurable. Second, it should remove most, if not all, low-quality businesses. Last, it should select most, if not all, high-quality businesses. Let's start with some guesses. A first plausible assumption would be a great management team. Great businesses and outstanding management teams seem like tautologies. Finding an excellent set of leaders may automatically lead us to a high-quality business. Even if it does not, it looks like a good starting point for our filter. An exceptional management team would ensure revenue and profit growth ahead of the competition, a balance sheet that is not risky, a sustainable competitive advantage, and products or services that customers love. Easy, right? Not so fast. How is an investor supposed to find a great management team? If you are a small investor, the best you can do is read their interviews, listen to their conference call recordings, check out their Twitter feeds, watch some of their interviews on YouTube, and peruse their annual reports. If you are a large or prominent investor, you might even be able to meet the senior leaders. However, in my experience as an investor, none of these activities helps an investor calibrate the quality of a management team. Here is a stark example. If you have time, I suggest watching the YouTube video of the January 2000 presentation by the president of Enron, Jeffrey Skilling, and his senior management on the launch of Enron Broadband. I dare you not to be impressed. The guys are poised, confident, and, at least to my eyes, extremely competent. It is hard to find fault with their strategy or vision, and their execution plan for broadband services seems spot on. However, in less than 2 years after this impressive presentation, Enron went bankrupt, and in 2006 Skilling was sent to prison for perpetrating a massive fraud. Except for a few short sellers, no professional analysts or investors could have guessed what was going on at Enron, even though the management was quite open to the media and regularly gave interviews. I know what you are thinking. Am I building my entire case on an outlier like Enron? Let's look at it another way. I assume you have read the interviews of many CEOs or company presidents. Did any mention that they don't care for the customer, that they have stopped innovating, or that they hire people who have been rejected by other companies? Have you ever heard a company leader disparage their products or services or admit that their competition is doing a better job or that they are sick and tired of company politics? You will rarely, if ever, learn anything insightful from what the management says. They always say what they have been taught to say, which at best is useless and at worst is harmful because, as with Enron, their words are persuasive. In my experience, when someone says, "This is a great management team," what they are actually saying is, "These guys talk so well." The great management team filter thus fails the first criterion of measurability, being easily measurable. I know that many professional investors will disagree with me. Many people in the fund management world pride themselves on their purported ability to separate the wheat from the chaff after a series of management meetings. Some of them may have this rare skill, but most are either deluded or lying. And if there is someone out there who can assess a company's quality by meeting management, we can applaud them from the sidelines without falling into the trap ourselves. What about other guesses for choosing a single company trait that could point to its overall quality? Could it be revenue growth? Markets seem to love companies growing at a fast pace. The problem with a revenue growth measure is this: how do we know what went into achieving this growth? In the previous chapter, I discussed the dot-com bust in the context of fast-changing industries. This period is also relevant when assessing high-growth businesses. In the late 1990s, most internet businesses were growing fast, but they were achieving this gravity-defying feat by spending millions of dollars of cash far in excess of their revenues. Predictably and unfortunately, growth did not turn out to be the blessing investors had hoped it would be. They ignored the cost of growth and suffered for it. Almost all the dot-coms went belly up eventually. By the end of 2005, the loss of market value of these newfangled businesses was almost $2 trillion. More recently, the spectacular failure of WeWork provides a lesson in funding hypergrowth by burning cash. As many of you may already know, SoftBank-funded WeWork became one of the largest co-working space companies on the planet and was once valued at $47 billion. In late 2021, its market value had fallen to about $5 billion. The company grew its revenues from $415 million in 2016 to $3.5 billion in 2019, an eightfold jump over just 3 years. Also in 2019, IWG, the old world co-working giant, had revenue of $2.7 billion, a growth of only 28% since 2016. WeWork was consuming cash as if it had a side business running a printing press for dollars. In the third quarter of 2019 alone, the company declared a loss of $1.25 billion. It had to pull its IPO in the fourth quarter. Many high-growth companies don't burn equity for growth but rely on debt instead, which is even worse because debt holders need their money back with great regularity, unlike equity investors. Do you remember the fast-growing Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns? Lehman grew its revenue by 36% annually from $17 billion in 2003 to $59 billion in 2007. This incremental revenue of about $40 billion was funded by an incremental debt of almost $90 billion. Similarly, Bear Stearns grew its revenue sevenfold from 2003 to 2007. Its incremental revenue of $3.5 billion during this period was primarily funded by an additional debt of $42 billion. When the financial crisis hit in 2008, these highly leveraged entities, which had contributed to the problem, had nowhere to hide. They both collapsed that year. I also have a personal reason for not wanting revenue growth to be the primary selection criterion. In my experience, high-growth businesses can hide myriad problems ranging from issues of product or service quality, employee culture, and accounting to a bloated balance sheet. According to a study conducted by the Kauffman Foundation and Incorporated magazine, 5 to 8 years after the magazine had identified 5,000 businesses as fastest-growing, 2/3 of those had shut down, downsized, or been sold disadvantageously. I hope you will agree that while high growth is easy to measure, it stumbles on our second filtering criterion, removing most, if not all, low-quality businesses. I know. You will counter me with just one word: Apple. This fantastic business grew its revenue 33-fold from 2004 to 2020 at an annualized growth of 25%. But for every apple, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of lemons. Okay, let's recap. We want to use a single filter F to select businesses for further analysis. This should hopefully save us a lot of time and effort. We wondered if we could use quality management teams or fast growth as our starting point. We rejected both as good candidates for F because it is tough to assess the former and the latter can end up causing heartburn. A third guess for a criterion for shortlisting businesses for further analysis could be margins. Is a high-margin business a high-quality business? Many seem to think so. Margins can mean many things: gross margin, sales minus cost of goods sold divided by sales, EBITDA margin, earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization divided by sales, or EBIT margin. Earnings before interest and tax divided by sales. Which of these, if any, should we choose for F? Let's start with gross margin, which measures the direct cost of producing the product or service being sold. Accountants call this the cost of goods sold. If a bar of bath soap retails for $1 and costs 30 cents to make, then the gross margin is 70%. Does a high gross margin tell us anything about the quality of the business? Not really. Several internet businesses boasted a gross margin of more than 90% in the dot-com era, but almost all experienced huge losses because of their marketing spends. What about EBITDA margin or EBIT margin, also called operating margin? Measuring EBIT margin would be more sensible because it accounts for depreciation, which is a real cost of doing business. But just because it is a better measure does not mean it is a good measure. Take this example of two real-world businesses. Business C has had an operating margin of about 3% over the past 15 years. Business T has delivered an operating margin of 19% over the same period. Would you reject Business C and select Business T because T is better than C? If you did so, you would have spurned Costco, one of America's best-run businesses. Business T is Tiffany & Company, a reasonably well-run business but not as well-run as Costco. What makes Costco at a margin of 3% a better company than Tiffany at 19%? I will get to that shortly. Suffice it to say that using margins as a starting point to narrow our list of companies may lead us astray. It fails our second and third criteria, removing most, if not all, low-quality businesses and selecting high-quality businesses. We haven't yet considered macro factors for building the shortlist. But which single piece of macro data should we consider for shortlisting individual businesses? For example, if experts believe that inflation will rise, should we shortlist only consumer goods businesses able to pass on the increased cost to their customers? If we do so, should we then completely revise the list if the inflation expectations get reversed within 6 months? I don't know how to account for macro factors for shortlisting high-quality businesses. I am not suggesting that it is the wrong thing to do, just that I don't know how it can be done. And so, we avoid considering any macro factor as our preliminary filter F. What about accounting for macro factors when making our final list? More on that later. The evolutionary cascade of a single selection criterion. Meanwhile, we seem to be stuck. What could F be? Maybe Ludmilla and her tail-wagging ember can help us. But before we seek guidance from them, let's briefly visit the Russia of the 1920s and 30s. The brutal communist regime under Joseph Stalin was forcing individual farmers to give up their land and consolidate their holdings under kolkhozy, or collective farms. The central planners of the Communist Party had envisaged a dramatic increase in agriculture production and productivity arising from scale economies and improved control of output by the state. They expected to be able to feed the rising urban population and increase exports. The opposite happened. The farmers strongly resisted giving up their ancestral land and property. In fact, many chose to destroy their crops and slaughter their animals instead of giving in to collectivization. Stalin sent millions of people to prison camps and millions more died of starvation as famine set in owing to the reduction in agriculture production. In the middle of this disaster, Trofim Lysenko, an agriculture scientist, claimed that he had invented a new technique to significantly increase agriculture production. This new technique envisaged that a plant's acquired characteristics could be inherited. This was in stark contrast to Mendelian genetics and Darwinism, which had demonstrated, by this time experimentally, that genes were the unit of inheritance. Lysenko, however, promised an agricultural revolution with his unscientific techniques and got the attention of Stalin, who desperately needed a Russian hero to solve his food crisis. Over time, as Lysenko became more powerful, he declared genetics a pseudoscience, and practicing geneticists were either executed or sent to labor camps. In this environment, the authorities fired the leading geneticist Dmitry Belyaev from his job at the Department of Fur Animal Breeding at the Central Research Laboratory. Belyev's elder brother, who was studying the genetics of silkworms, was executed at Lysenko's behest in 1937. Dmitri, however, kept studying genetics in secret. In 1959, with Nikita Khrushchev's ascension to power, he became the director of the Institute of Cytology and Genetics of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Novosibirsk, Siberia. Dmitri held this post for 26 years until his death in 1985. And during this time he conducted one of the most remarkable, longest-running experiments in the history of biology. The investigation continues today. Dmitri Belyaev wanted to answer two questions. 1. How had the domestication of animals, example, dogs, pigs, goats, and cows, started? And 2. Why did most domestic animals have similar characteristics, including floppy ears, curly tails, a piebald coloration, patches of black and white, and babyish faces? He believed that the domestication of animals resulted from underlying heritable genetic changes that had occurred during the course of selection over millennia. The big unanswered question was, what was being selected? Natural and artificial selection can occur only if something is selected for generation after generation. For example, whereas both cheetahs and lions are ferocious predators, among many other factors, cheetahs have been selected for speed and lions for their size and strength. In other words, a slow cheetah is unlikely to leave any offspring, but a big, strong lion is likely to leave many. Dmitri hypothesized that the key factor selected when our ancestors domesticated wild animals was tameness. Thus, the unit of selection was not related to an animal's physical attributes but to its behavior. This was an audacious guess since most scientists then assumed that physical morphology was the unit of selection. How could Dmitri test his bold theory? Only by going back to the time when animals first started becoming domesticated. For dogs, this would have meant experimenting on wild wolves. But getting a supply of wolves would have been very hard in Siberia, so he chose the silver fox. He designed a selective breeding experiment that focused only on tameness as the selection factor. As described earlier, he recruited Ludmila Trut, an undergraduate student at the prestigious Moscow University, to lead and manage the experiment in Siberia. Ludmila would forever change the field of behavioral genetics with her tenacity and creativity. Ludmila's first task was to select a location for breeding the foxes. She chose a large commercial farm that sold fox fur, called Lesnoy, more than 350 kilometers from Novosibirsk, where she and her family lived. She began the experiment in the fall of 1960 with about a dozen foxes. She also hired several women from nearby villages to be caretakers and experimenters. Here's how it worked. The experimenters gave the foxes a series of tests from the time they were 1 month old to their sexual maturity at 6 to 7 months. When a fox pup was 1 month old, the experimenter extended her hand to offer it food while trying to stroke it. She tested the fox pup twice, once in the cage and once while the pup was roaming freely with other pups in a larger enclosure. She repeated this test monthly until the pup reached sexual maturity. To ensure that the pup's reaction to these tests was based solely on genetic selection, the pups were not trained and did not have any human contact except for their brief interactions with the experimenters. The pups were caged with their mothers until they were about 2 months old and then with their littermates. At about 3 months of age, they were put into their own cages. When the pups were about 7 months old, the experimenters assigned them to one of 3 categories based on their tameness. Class 3 foxes were unfriendly toward the handlers and either ran away from them or were aggressive. Class 2 foxes behaved neutrally and displayed no emotional response toward the handlers. Class 1 foxes were the friendliest and seemed to want to engage with the handlers. Ludmila and her team selected a few of the calmest Class 1 foxes for mating and repeated the experiment with the next generation of pups. By the 3rd generation in 1962, Ludmila noticed that some of the tamer foxes had started mating a few days earlier than usual and were producing slightly larger litters than wild foxes. Otherwise, there was no indication of any significant change. In April 1963, as Ludmila approached the cages of the 4th generation of pups, she saw a male pup called Ember vigorously wagging his tail. This was precisely what a puppy would do. But no one had ever witnessed a silver fox, whether in a cage or the wild, wag its tail at a human. Ember wagged his tail at other humans too. No other pup of his generation did so, but even a single fox radically altering its behavior to mimic a dog was significant news. Dmitri had told Ludmila in their first meeting that he wanted to make a dog out of a fox. Had the process begun? In 1966, many of the sixth-generation pups that Ember had sired started wagging their tails at the handlers. Ember had not been an anomaly, he was a trailblazer. Ludmilla had categorically demonstrated that tail wagging was genetically heritable. By this time, the researchers had to add another class of foxes called Class 1E, the Elites. These foxes were extremely friendly, were eager to establish human contact, and, like dogs, whimpered to attract attention. In the sixth generation, about 1.8% of the pups were elites. By the 20th generation, almost 35% had reached elite status. After about 35 generations, more than 70% of the population had attained elite status. This is a breakneck pace of evolution. In less than 40 years, Dmitri and Ludmilla's experiment had essentially converted a population of wild foxes who avoided humans into dog-like creatures that could be kept as pets in any of our homes. These foxes were very docile, competed for human attention, and formed deep emotional bonds with their handlers. It had become hard to distinguish their behavior from that of dogs. Ludmilla and her team had erased their wildness almost completely. But don't raise your eyebrows in astonishment just yet. I haven't even told you the most interesting result of the experiment. The experimenters noticed that the eighth generation of these tamer foxes also started displaying some novel physical traits. The first change was in coat color. Some of the foxes' fur had a piebald pattern, which is common among domesticated animals like sheep, dogs, horses, pigs, goats, mice, and guinea pigs. A piebald pattern forms when two colors, typically black and white, form irregular patches on the animal's skin. No wild foxes in the experiment were piebald, but as their tameness increased over the generations, they started showing this coloration. Further physical traits to appear were floppy ears and rolled tails, again, common among many domesticated species, especially dogs. In 1974, Ludmilla decided to raise the experiment's stakes by living with the foxes in the same house. To start, she chose a friendly fox called Pashinka. One evening, Ludmilla was sitting on a bench outside her home with Pashinka relaxing next to her as usual. Suddenly, Pashinka got up as if she had heard something and started barking. It turned out to be the night guard, and Pashinka stopped her aggressive posturing and barking when she realized that the guard posed no imminent danger to Ludmilla. This guard dog-like behavior, rushing to protect a human from a potential threat, had never been observed before by Ludmilla. In the early 1990s, the team also started noticing that the skulls and jaws of the domesticated foxes had started diverging from those of their wild brethren. The cranial height and width of the domesticated foxes' skulls had shortened. Their snouts had become shorter and wider, giving them a baby-like appearance, almost exactly mimicking the differences between a dog and a wolf. Let's consider this for a moment. Remember, Dmitri and his team were selecting for only one trait, the willingness of foxes to be tamed. They weren't interested in body size, coat color, skull shape, ear stiffness, or anything else. The experimenters took great care to ensure selection based only on tameness. But this single filter of a behavioral characteristic had triggered many physical changes in the animals. How could this have happened? There were no new mutations in the domesticated silver foxes, but their gene expression had changed owing to the selection for tameness. This is how a gene does not change but alters what it expresses. It produces more or fewer chemicals like proteins or hormones. For example, when a dog owner stares lovingly into their canine's eyes, oxytocin is released in the systems of both the dog and the owner, creating a positive feedback loop in which the two enjoy each other's company more and more. If the same owner encounters an unknown dog on the street, no oxytocin is released. Although it's the same gene in question, the gene expression is different in different situations. Scientists have demonstrated that gene expression needs to change only a little to have a significant impact on an animal's body and behavior. As Ludmilla and her team selected tamer foxes, they unknowingly impacted the expression of a select set of genes. This selection altered the amount and timing of release of certain neurochemicals and hormones that regulated the developmental and physical traits of the foxes. For example, the hormone melatonin is known to manipulate the timing of mating in many species. The researchers found that the elite females released a lot more melatonin than their class 2 and 3 peers and were ready for mating a few days earlier than normal. The hormonal change was so extreme that some females were ready to mate twice a year, a phenomenon never seen in the wild. Selecting for tameness had impacted the reproductive cycle of the species. A gene called HTR2C produced much higher levels of serotonin and dopamine in the elites than in wild foxes. Serotonin is a key hormone in shaping the early development of an animal, and its increase is likely to have changed the physiology and behavior of the domesticated foxes. The researchers also discovered that the tamed foxes had much lower levels of adrenaline than their wild cousins. Adrenaline regulates the production of melanin, which determines the coloration of skin and fur. The silver fox experiment also solved the centuries-old puzzle of the numerous physical similarities among domesticated animals discussed earlier. Dmitry had rightly hypothesized that since mammals share similar hormonal and neurotransmitter regulatory systems, selecting for tameness would unleash broadly similar developmental and physical changes in them as well. Dmitry and Ludmila's experiment, now running for more than 60 years, has demonstrated that evolution does not occur piecemeal. The behavior and physiology of animals are intimately connected. Darwin, with his acute powers of observation, knew this. His statement at the beginning of this chapter asserts that hairless dogs have imperfect teeth and pigeons with feathered feet have skin between their outer toes. He predicted that if humans choose to select for one characteristic, they will surely also cause transformations in other characteristics owing to what he called the mysterious laws of the correlation of growth. Dmitry and Ludmila had proven Darwin right. Select one, get many free. As an investor, would you not want to be in the position of selecting just one trait of a business but getting many high-quality attributes for free? As discussed earlier, this single trait should satisfy 3 criteria. It should be measurable, reject most businesses of poor quality, and select most high-quality businesses. Most, not necessarily all. We have seen that some factors like high-quality management, revenue growth, and margins do not serve the purpose well enough. At Nalanda, here is what we begin with while shortlisting businesses: historical return on capital employed, ROCE. The first word first. Historical. I devote an entire chapter to this important and oft-ignored word, but for now I wanted to clarify that the ROCE number is what a business has delivered in the past. We don't listen to stories about how our ROCE will improve in the future. We want to assess a company purely on its historically delivered ROCE. Now let's look at some definitions. ROCE is simply the operating profit of the business as a percentage of total capital employed. As defined earlier, operating profit is earnings before interest and taxes, or EBIT. Why do we not use profit after tax, PAT, instead? Remember, we want to understand a business's operating performance, and mixing it with financial measures like tax and interest will muddy the waters. We do not ignore tax or interest charges in our overall evaluation of the business, but for calculating our ROCE, we limit ourselves to operating performance. What about total capital employed? This typically comprises 2 factors: net working capital and net fixed assets. In the net working capital number, we like to exclude excess cash, that is, cash minus debt if cash happens to be much greater than debt, because extra cash is not an operating asset. Also, high ROCE companies generate a lot of cash, and incorporating cash into the capital employed number will unnecessarily reduce ROCE. If you are uncomfortable with this, you can include a portion of cash in capital employed. For an acquisitive company, we also include the capital invested in acquiring businesses, but let's keep things simple for the moment. Thus, our ROCE for non-financial companies can be defined as follows. EBIT divided by net working capital plus net fixed assets. Do you now see why using operating margin to filter businesses may not be the best approach? Margins do not tell us what we had to invest to get those margins. The advantage of measuring our ROCE is that it accounts for the quality of P&L in the numerator as well as the balance sheet in the denominator. Let's return to Costco and Tiffany. I claimed that Costco at an operating margin of 3% is a better business than Tiffany at 19%. If we limit our definition of better to the level of our ROCE, then I was right. This is because Costco's average ROCE from 2014 to 2019, pre-pandemic, was 22% compared to Tiffany's 16%. Costco is deploying its capital much more effectively than Tiffany, and this more than compensates for Costco's low margin. Let's take the example of just one important part of its capital employed: inventory. Costco keeps about 31 days of inventory in its warehouses and retail stores. Guess the same number for Tiffany. It is 521 days, or almost a year and a half. Tiffany's operating margin is impressive, but Costco's dramatically better management of its inventory and other assets ensures it earns a higher ROCE than Tiffany. Many investors prefer return on equity, ROE. I don't. ROE is calculated after taxes and interest payments and hence mixes operating performance with financing strategy and tax structure. As a business owner, I am much more concerned with the superior operating performance of a business. While taking on leverage which will improve our ROE but not our ROCE, and planning for taxes may benefit a firm in the short to medium term, in my experience, success over the long term comes only by running great operations. Which brings us back to our ROCE. What does a higher ROCE of, say, 20% tell us? A simple fact: this business earns $20 for every $100 it invests. This is equivalent to making a bank deposit of $100 and earning $20 on it after a year. No, you are not in a hyperinflationary Latin American economy, but in the normal world. I assume you would be on the moon if you owned a higher ROCE business like that. They are rare, but they do exist, and when you find them, they will tell you a lot. Higher ROCE is a lot like tameness in the Siberian silver foxes. Just as tameness brings with it a curly tail, piebald fur, and floppy ears, a higher ROCE business ushers in many attributes relevant for an owner like us at Nalanda. Here are some examples. A consistently high ROCE business is likely to be run by an excellent management team. What? Excellent management team, again? If we can't measure it directly, why am I sneaking it in indirectly? Just because we can't measure management quality through interviews and discussions does not mean quality management teams do not exist. Of course they do. What we need is not some airy-fairy impression of an investor made over a coffee or a Zoom call, but a quantitative measure. We don't vote for the best cricket bowler, best running back, or best marathoner based on their interviews or their ability to articulate their excellence, so why should we do it for management teams? The best bowling statistics and the best finish times determine the best bowler and the best marathoner. Similarly, in my view, an excellent but not the only indicator of the quality of the management team is their historical track record on the quantity of ROCE. Sustaining high ROCE in any industry over any length of time is extraordinarily hard. Microeconomic theory states that excess returns should be driven to zero in competitive markets, which means that businesses need to run very hard simply to earn their cost of capital. This may be true for most businesses, but there are a select set of companies that defy logic and competition to earn high returns on capital year on year, decade after decade. The median historical ROCE of our portfolio of 30 businesses, most of which are more than 35 to 40 years old, is about 42%. I am obviously biased since I am an investor in these businesses, but I do think the management teams of these businesses are excellent. Are they exemplary, or am I just calling them first-rate because they happen to have higher ROCE? I don't know. Does it matter? We should expect the following from a quality management team: that they deliver products and services to their customers that are superior to those of their competitors, allocate capital prudently, attract and retain quality employees, manage their cost structure which is commensurate with their size and revenue, maintain a quality balance sheet, and continuously innovate by taking calculated risks. All this should and does correlate with high ROCE. A consistently high ROCE business is likely to have a strong competitive advantage. All long-term investors, mentored by more than 5 decades of Buffett's letters and annual meetings, demand that companies have a sustainable competitive advantage, SCA. But how does one go about assessing whether a company has an SCA? If you peruse business and investment books, the sources of SCA turn out to be the usual suspects: brand, intellectual property, network effect, economies of scale, and low cost. Let's analyze brand as a source of competitive advantage. Almost every investor I know justifies a consumer-focused company's stock market success by touting brand and distribution as the sources of competitive advantage. One of the great consumer-focused investment success stories began more than 30 years ago in 1988 and 1989 when Buffett purchased Coke and Gillette shares. Berkshire invested almost $600 million in Coke in 1988 and nearly the same amount in Gillette in 1989. By 1993, the combined value of these two shareholdings for Berkshire was $5.6 billion, which was equal to all other holdings combined, and Buffett was sitting on a gain of about $4 billion in these businesses. His commentary on Coke and Gillette in his 1993 annual letter is as follows: the might of their brand names, the attributes of their products, and the strength of their distribution systems give them an enormous competitive advantage, setting up a protective moat around their economic castles. Buffett, as usual, is correct. Almost 3 decades after this letter, Coke and Gillette continue to be enormous successes and, given their increasing market share, continue to have a solid competitive advantage. But did Buffett conclude that they had a strong competitive advantage because they had strong brands and product attributes, or was his claim based on the empirical fact that these businesses had high ROCE and an increasing market share over a long period? We will never know, of course. My guess, contention, is that it was the latter. The reality is that most brands don't have any, forget about sustainable, competitive advantage. Depending on which source you believe, across tens of thousands of brand launches annually in the United States, the failure rate is 80 to 90%. It's not as bad as buying a lottery ticket, but it's also not that far off. You may also think that failure is limited to small and untested businesses and that the likes of Coke and Pepsi do very well. You would be wrong. Here is just a small sample of spectacular brand failures from large companies: New Coke, Coca-Cola, Crystal Pepsi, Pepsi, Premier Smokeless Cigarettes, R.J. Reynolds, Maxwell House Ready-to-Drink Coffee, General Mills, Super Combo, a combined soup and sandwich meal from Campbell, and all-natural cleaning vinegar, Heinz. Just having a brand means nothing. If something is simple to understand as a brand does not necessarily confer a competitive advantage, and even if it does, it is probably very tough to definitively say so. How do we know if a company has a competitive advantage? No prizes for guessing. Yes, a sustained high ROCE is a good starting point to conclude that the company may have some kind of competitive advantage. And if it is a consumer company like Coca-Cola, maybe it is the brand, maybe the distribution, maybe the management, and maybe some combination of these and other factors. Once we have shortlisted a company based on its sustained high ROCE, we start analyzing its competitive advantages. After weeks or months of research, we may conclude that this high ROCE is unsustainable and that the company just got lucky historically. So be it. We then choose to stay away. But taking this route of starting our assessment of competitive advantage only for high ROCE companies saves us a lot of time and effort. A consistently high ROCE business allocates capital well. As a very long-term investor, when we choose to buy shares of a business, we allocate our capital to that business. We are doing so hoping that we will earn a decent return on this capital over the long run. Hopefully, we have evaluated other options for our capital and have made the correct decision that it is best invested in this business. Investors who allocate capital well perform well. Those who don't. Businesses are no different. They too allocate capital on an ongoing basis. They have many options and they try to choose the best one. They too hope to earn a decent return on their investment. Some do, most don't. ROCE is an excellent measure of a company's ability to deploy capital. High ROCE implies that these businesses earn high operating profit relative to their capital deployed. Great businesses try neither to maximize operating profit nor minimize capital deployed. They try to earn the maximum operating profit per unit of capital deployed. Investors may not realize it, but strategy and most capital allocation decisions are deeply intertwined. For instance, is setting up a manufacturing plant in Milwaukee versus outsourcing to China a strategic or a capital allocation decision? It doesn't matter, it is a decision that will significantly influence the company's success. And so, it is both. Some more examples of strategic decisions that allocate capital in radically different ways are as follows. Setting up one's own R&D division versus copying the best designs from the market. Hiring a chief technology officer to build one's technology unit versus outsourcing it. Building a manufacturing unit for critical parts versus funding a supplier. Hiring young graduates and training them over many years versus hiring qualified professionals laterally. Making an acquisition to enter new geography versus growing organically. Funding a loss-making product in a large addressable market versus investing in profitable products in a small market and advertising for many months on social media versus buying a single Super Bowl ad. How does an investor know if these myriad capital allocation decisions are sensible? One way is to analyze them thoroughly. For example, one could interview the marketing head to understand why they bought the Super Bowl ad instead of spreading the same expense over many weeks or months of advertising on Google or Facebook. One could then build financial models to test the company's likelihood of success, compare its advertising strategy to other companies, and then reach a conclusion that either supports or contradicts its decision. The second way, our way, is to select companies with high ROCE as the first filter. We assume that a company with high ROCE is, on average, deploying its capital well. It may make some poor decisions, but overall, we believe its capital allocation and strategic decisions are quite sound. Also, frankly, it's just easier this way. If I were to try to build multi-megabyte spreadsheets to test various scenarios of a particular capital decision, I would fail miserably. Twice. Once in making the spreadsheet and again in reaching an erroneous conclusion. So why try? A consistently high ROCE business allows companies to take business risk without taking financial risk, which increases the chance of business success. Capitalism thrives on risk-taking. And risk-taking is not limited just to teenagers starting companies in their garages in Silicon Valley. All companies, if they want to grow and succeed, need to keep taking calculated risks. Those that don't take risks either atrophy or remain small and irrelevant. Those that venture to take bigger risks than warranted implode. It is in the Goldilocks zone of calculated risk-taking that most companies thrive. Higher ROCE allows a company to keep taking calculated business risks. This is how. A company delivering high ROCE with modest revenue growth will generate excess cash. This is not an opinion, just a mathematical fact. For example, Company X growing its sales at 10% with ROCE of 25% can grow from zero cash to a cash balance of almost 18% of sales in 5 years. Other assumptions: margin 15%, tax 30%. With an increasing cash cushion, X's management team can choose to launch new products or target new geography. Even if the new business fails, X can recover given its ability to generate cash from its core business. Now let's look at its competitor, Y, which is growing at the same rate, 10%, with the same margin, 15%, but with a lower ROCE of 12%. In 5 years, Y would have a negative cash balance of 3% of revenue. In other words, Y would have to borrow to grow at the same rate as X. With a weaker balance sheet and a lack of spare cash, Y would be forced to either forego new opportunities or borrow more money to launch a new product or venture in new geography. If the venture fails, Y could be in deep trouble because its core business is not generating enough cash to repay the loan and interest when due. This would further widen the gap between companies X and Y. Over time, X would grow larger and more successful, and Y would be just a shadow of X. We see this phenomenon play out across many industries in which a few players have tended to become more dominant given their ability to generate cash on account of high ROCE. What happens if a company with high ROCE stumbles? Let me share the example of Havells, a Nalanda portfolio company since 2011. Havells is India's largest consumer electrical equipment business and sells fans, lights and lighting fixtures, circuit breakers, wire, water heaters, and kitchen appliances like blenders and toasters. Havells delivered 52% ROCE from 2007 to 2017 under its exceptional leader, Anil Gupta. Its annualized revenue growth was about 15% during this period, and Havells was sitting on a cash balance of $230 million in March 2017. This was about 28% of revenue that year. In May 2017, Havells acquired the consumer business of Lloyd Electric, primarily for Lloyd's fast-growing air conditioner business. We were not too thrilled with this acquisition. While the company was clearly not taking a financial risk with the acquisition since its cash balance was larger than the acquisition price, it was taking a risk that was outside our comfort zone. The biggest issue, we thought, was the difference in culture and company mindset. Havells sells high-quality products at a premium to the discerning Indian consumer. It does so by setting up high-tech manufacturing plants, customizing product features to the needs of the consumer, staying ahead of the technology curve, and creating brand pull by advertising on TV and the internet. Lloyd seemed to be the exact opposite of Havells in many ways. It had gained market share over the past decade by aggressively pushing low-priced air conditioners imported from China. While Havells pulled consumers, Lloyd pushed its products by offering large dealer incentives and product discounts. Lloyd seemed singularly focused on growth at any price, whereas Havells' growth was an outcome of delivering quality products and building the trust of dealers and consumers over 6 decades. Prior to Lloyd, one of the main sources of Havells' success was its ability to launch new products through its existing sales channel. The company has built a loyal and high-performing dealership network over many decades. This symbiotic relationship has allowed Havells to manufacture and sell an extensive range of consumer durables from fans to circuit breakers to toasters. However, for the first time with the Lloyd acquisition, Havells was unable to use the strength of its dealer network because the air conditioner sales channel was completely different from the consumer electricals channel in India. Unsurprisingly, the company immediately began facing problems with the acquisition. It started with the resignation of the CEO of Lloyd and many senior managers within a few months of the change in ownership. Havells found that Lloyd was selling its products through only a few dealers who had grown quite powerful over the years. These dealers were demanding higher margins and a greater share of Lloyd's business. When Havells refused, many of these dealers left, adversely impacting the sales and profitability of the business. There was also some level of dissonance while the Havells management tried to reconcile two radically different brand positioning approaches, the premium positioning of Havells versus the aggressive price warrior stance of Lloyd. Within 2 years of the acquisition, research analysts downgraded Havells as Lloyd's numbers continued to disappoint. At this stage, Gupta could have taken the easy route of allowing Lloyd to revert to its old business ways. This would have preserved revenue and profit momentum and created two different kinds of business under the same umbrella. But he decided to take the much tougher road of instituting long-term fundamental changes to Lloyd's organization and business model. Gupta repositioned the Lloyd brand from being a low-priced, average-quality product that offered only basic features to a high-quality product whose features matched or exceeded the best in the market. Havells invested about $35 million to set up a new state-of-the-art air conditioner plant that is now producing high-end, feature-rich air conditioners. Over many months, Gupta gradually replaced the senior management of Lloyd with leaders steeped in the Havells culture. The company refused to be blackmailed by a few powerful dealers and built a new, more resilient distribution network despite losing sales in the short term. Lloyd is now integrated with Havells and there is complete alignment with their strategic and organizational priorities. One key reason Havells was able to withstand short-term pain to achieve its longer-term goals was the availability of cash on the balance sheet. And the reason it had accumulated cash was its exceptionally high ROCE over many years. It's easy for any company to claim that it is working for long-term value creation, but these words are worthless without the courage provided by a cash cushion. We will never know what would have happened if Havells had had a lot of debt and interest to repay, but I doubt it would have had the same determination to continue on a challenging, lengthy, and uncertain path with bankers breathing down its neck. Havells made a moderately risky acquisition, took the time and effort to integrate it despite initial hiccups, and converted what could have been a significant misstep into a strategic success. Anil Gupta rocks. Havells rocks. Because 52% ROCE rocks. There are no guarantees in investing. Just as selecting for tameness in silver foxes helped Dmitry and Ludmila generate many other traits in the animals, selecting for high ROCE has ensured that we have chosen businesses with many other desirable qualities. After the companies have been through the risk filter, as I discussed in Chapter 1, we reject companies with long-term historical ROCE lower than 20%. Our preliminary short list of about 150 companies consists only of those that have delivered ROCE of more than 20% over the past 5 to 10 years or more. I have not claimed that we look only at our ROCE to arrive at our conclusion on a business. That would border on being reckless and foolish. What I have said, though, is that we start the evaluation of a business by studying the record of its delivered historical ROCE. If you are an investor or choose to be one, you will develop your method and style of investing. But whatever you do, starting with a good understanding of the historical ROCE of a business will ensure you are miles ahead of your competition. Buy one, get many free. As you may have guessed, there are two problems with the approach of choosing ROCE as the first filter. First, a consistently high ROCE in the past does not guarantee that ROCE will be high in the future. For example, if a business has a monopoly in its industry, say, of operating local bus services or a copper mine, even a poor-quality management team would probably be able to earn a decent return on capital. When the monopoly ends, however, we may see our ROCE trend downward. Similarly, if there is high tariff protection for a product or commodity, domestic companies manufacturing the same product or commodity may earn decent profits without breaking a sweat. And then there is luck. A company can make decent ROCE for a few years if its key competitors get in trouble of their own making. While making the preliminary shortlist, we can easily eliminate these kinds of companies because they are easy to identify. However, another category of potential losers with high historical ROCE is tough to identify beforehand. A high-quality business can also lose its way if the founder gets distracted, the company decides to change its strategy, the management bets the company on a failed acquisition, or an aggressive new competitor makes life difficult for the company. While High-ROCE can provide some cushion in the face of these mishaps, there are limits to which it can safeguard a business hellbent on destroying itself. But remember, this chapter is about where you start looking for great businesses, not what guarantees great investment return. Spoiler alert, nothing does. The second problem with making a preliminary list of only high-ROCE businesses is that it rejects companies that may become hugely successful in the future. Take Netflix. If we had evaluated Netflix in early 2018, its median ROCE for the previous 10 years, 2008 to 2017, of 10% would have been too low for us to include it on our preliminary list. We would have missed out on a spectacular wealth creation opportunity. Netflix's stock price jumped 2.9 times from January 2018 to December 2021. But here is the thing. We would have looked at this lost opportunity and not regretted it one bit. I know we will lose Netflix-like businesses, and I am okay with it. Our strategy of selecting only high-ROCE companies for our initial list invariably excludes some potential winners, but it also excludes hundreds of low-quality businesses that we would never want to own. Thus, on average, I believe this approach works well for us. We will not change our approach just because others have made money with a strategy that we have chosen to avoid. C'est la vie. In early 2022, I wrote to the Institute of Cytology and Genetics at Novosibirsk. I had two questions for them. First, was the Fox experiment still ongoing? And second, was Ludmila Trut still active? I assumed the answer to both would be an emphatic no. After all, Ludmila had begun the experiment in 1959, more than 60 years ago. I was surprised when Yuri Herbeck, the deputy head of the Laboratory for Evolutionary Genetics at the Institute, promptly replied to my email. Can one be pleasantly shocked? If so, I was. Not only is the experiment still ongoing, but Ludmila Trut, who is now almost 90 years old, is still active. And not only is she active in the Institute, she is also publishing path-breaking scientific articles. Herbeck was kind enough to attach 4 research articles published by Ludmila Trut and others in prestigious scientific journals in recent years. The latest one was published in the Journal of Neuroscience on July 14, 2021, and is titled Neuromorphological Changes Following Selection for Tameness and Aggression in the Russian Farm Fox Experiment. I used to feel proud that we have been successfully investing for over 15 years. No longer. After reading about Ludmila Trut, who has maintained her passion, discipline, and excellence over more than 60 years, I am confronted with a stark and painful reality. We have a very long way to go. Chapter Summary. Evolutionary theory has taught me that, to avoid getting drowned by a deluge of data and information, we can reimagine investing by initially selecting a single business trait that brings with it many favorable business qualities. 1. In nature, selection for just one trait can influence many other behavioral and physical qualities of an organism. 2. Dmitry Belayev and Ludmila Trut's long-term experiment in Siberia has shown that selecting for tameness in wild silver foxes transforms them into a creature not unlike a pet dog over very few generations. The foxes become docile and crave human attention. They also develop floppy ears, a piebald coloration, and a shorter snout, and can be reproductively active more than once a year. 3. Investors could benefit immensely by homing in on a business trait that, when selected, brings along many other favorable qualities with it. Some popular parameters like management quality, high growth, and high margins are inappropriate or inadequate. 4. The single business quality that correlates favorably with many other areas of business excellence is historical return on capital employed, ROCE. We start our analysis by selecting only those businesses that have historically delivered high ROCE. 5. Higher ROCE generally, but not necessarily, indicates that the management team is stellar, they allocate capital effectively, they have built a strong competitive advantage over their peers, and they have room to innovate and grow. 6. Selecting for ROCE is a good starting point of analysis. It helps us narrow down our choices. We do a lot more work to create a short list of attractive businesses after this initial filter. 7. However, not all businesses with high historical ROCE will necessarily continue to be considered good businesses. There are no guarantees in investing.